Well, hello. This is our last chapter that we're looking at in our textbook for this semester, Chapter 16, the Interrelationships of the Humanities. And a lot of this content is very intellectual, analytical, and philosophical, but should really help you with your final projects because many of them are value-based. All right, let's take a look here. First of all, and we're starting on page 400. There's a lot of terms and ideas, so hopefully I'm just going to help make them a little clearer for you like I would in class. And first of all, we look at the relationship between the humanities and what's called the sciences and distinguishing between those. And you have that at the college level, you have the arts and sciences, humanities and the sciences. So humanities in a big category are all the arts that we've looked at, but the humanities would also include things like history, philosophy, and theology. Other things might be included. There's overlap with psychology, anthropology, sociology, political science, economics, business administration, and education because they deal with people. And while there's some scientific basis for them, they also deal with the factor that people are not machines. So there's that aspect. But never included are the things that are separate from people. They're just in a test tube or they're mathematical, like engineering and physics and chemistry. And the reason for that is that they just use strict scientific or objective standards, mathematical things there. There's not the variable that a human being brings into it per se. Someone who's a little bit of an exception is Carl Jung, who's a psychologist, but particularly his theories, and these are little examples of archetypes, he's really interested in the study of myth and the collective unconscious and archetypes, and that is not something you can measure objectively and scientifically. It's more of a theory and is expressed in the humanities than the arts. You see how these are very artistic. So you can't always clear cut, put everything into one category or the other. There's definitely some overlap, but the separation is how much the analysis of it and understanding of it is tied to the scientific method. And as you know from our last chapter, trying to determine whether something is art or art-like, there's some principles, but there's disagreement because you can't take a strict scientific method approach to it. And so you're always going to have some of those variables. If it can be strictly scientifically determined, then you aren't really dealing in the area of the humanities. All right, the arts and the other humanities, just kind of an overview. This is page 401. Artists, just to distinguish between them, which is what our focus really has been, humanities through the arts, focusing on art, they reveal and clarify values, where our humanists, our philosophers, our theologians, our historians reflect back upon those. But they do inform each other. They both help each other have a greater understanding of values. And the little picture I picked was the money and the watch. And of course, money is high value, economically, and it's a part of survival. It's just where culture runs. You have to have money to purchase the goods and the resources you need. But time is of great value, and some people might say time is money, or the time you spend with your family, right, is more important than the money you would make spent with that time at work or doing something else. So artists sometimes help us think about those values through literature and drama and music and so forth, and the humanists reflect on that and articulate that into philosophies. And so our focus in this chapter really is on values because that is something that's really important that the humanities in general and the arts give us that science cannot give us. And the basic definition is that a value is something we care about, something that matters. And then usually there's an object of interest involved in that. We value our health, or we value our family, or we value, health, family. Those are pretty top up there. In there we might value entertainment. We might value to some degree, a pleasure and entertainment, things like that. Education. When we just use the word by itself, we mean positive, but all values are not positive. There are negative values. I mean, it's the flip side. You have good values, positive values, things that we enjoy, and the negative values are the bad things, the things that we don't like. We value them in a negative way. So they're bad for us. They're bad health. They give us pain. So I put the little scales here, because life is full of both, and we kind of have to decide how we're going to spend our life and what we value. But there are also things that we put in the box of, or the thing of, that's a negative value, I'm not going to spend my time on that, or I'm not going to let it affect my view of life, or because I could get all depressed if I only focused on the negative values. The sort of half full, half empty idea that we talk about with, there's people who go around and look at the glass and they say it's half full and others say it's half empty. Okay, that's what we're talking about there. So I value. Another way of categorizing and classifying values, we're on page 4.3, is intrinsic and extrinsic. Think about inside versus outside. Intrinsic, inside of us, just the feeling that we get from it, that's an intrinsic value. The extrinsic is the outside thing that might be the means, like the means. The really good example here is the money that gets the food. It's not that we eat the money, right? The money, the dollar bill itself, does not provide us much intrinsic value. It's what we can purchase and exchange, with it. Our job sometimes is just the means to an end, right? There's sometimes, and we hope to have a job that we enjoy, and that gives us an intrinsic value, right? We feel good, we feel like we're accomplishing something of value, we feel like we're contributing, in a meaningful way, it's fulfilling. Those are intrinsic. The extrinsic is it's a means to an end. It's, so I can have a paycheck, so I can do the other things that I want to do besides work. So that's the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic. The means to the end, or just in and itself. In the arts, you can have both. Participation in the arts may have both. I put the little image here. It looks like a grandmother and a little girl cooking, and cooking has an extrinsic value, external. I mean, you have to eat to survive, to have health, right? But there's an intrinsic value of when you're cooking together with someone that you love. Some people get an intrinsic value just in cooking. They don't cook just to eat, but they cook because they enjoy cooking. They enjoy the pleasure of having good food for people that they love. It's an act of love, or just that you're doing it together is some intrinsic value. Theories of value. I told you this was going to be more intellectual, and there's really not a lot to give pictures to, but I thought this kind of captured it. There are three subjectivist theories. Is the interest projects the value onto something. Okay, so it comes from inside us and we project it onto that thing. Objectivists say the object is what creates the interest. So one is we look at the item and we give it value, or the object itself creates interest in us. And then a third kind of combines it, relational theory. It's the value emerges from the relation between interest and an object. And this is kind of why I picked this picture. You have a little boy, and it's somebody he loves. Maybe presumably it's his dad. He's taking a picture, but there's this artwork in the background, right? And when that little boy is taking a picture of his dad, okay, it's because it's his dad, right? That's what's going to give it value there, the relationship. If it was a man he didn't know, there may not be any value to him. He's too young to understand the value of the artwork behind him. So while the value is projected, like the dad would probably recognize that. The object does not excite this little boy at all. The object of his dad does, but it's because of the relationship. So you would say this is really about the relational theory of value here. You could argue whether this object excites interest and is subjectivist, or whether we look at it and project value on it for whatever reason. Maybe because it's by a particular famous artist, and so we project value. Ooh, it's a Renoir, or it's a Rembrandt, which of course they painted, but just an example from what we've been studying, and we project the value on it. So those are different theories of how value is created. I couldn't come up with any pictures for these, sorry, but the criticism is in the intellectual world, and critiquing things and determining things, like we saw last time in those videos, especially the one by 60 Minutes where he interviewed some art critics, and they're going, does this have some intrinsic value? Why are people paying so much money for these? Does it have enough intrinsic value? And of course there was disagreement there, but they focus on that. Right now they recognize that the culture, the art world, is projecting extrinsic or relational, maybe, that objectivist value on these items, the vacuum cleaner, the blank canvas, or they wouldn't fetch the money. But the critics that are going, but it doesn't really have any, that don't think it's art, say there's no real intrinsic value. The only value it has is right now, it's kind of hot. It's the item. It's novel. It's popular. It's trending. And at the end of that video, he talked about one of the art critics. That, those artists, he says, live in fear that all of a sudden that extrinsic value, that objectivist value that's being projected is going to disappear. It's not going to be the hot thing anymore, and it's going to disappear because it doesn't have the intrinsic value. Ethics, the study of ethics, whether something's right or wrong, focuses on both intrinsic and extrinsic values as they are and as they ought to be. So they do the moral code kind of thing. And the last term related to this is normative values. Normative values are kind of what's the standard at the time, and sometimes those change. They're either ideals of what ought to be and they're standard, or they're sort of the accepted norm. And you can go back and see how what's normal for one culture and one time is not always normal or the norm for another. It's because it changes. So some of those, it just recognizes that some of those values change over time, but the humanities kind of help us clarify, make those clear and define them. The last part, focus on arts and history. We're looking at the interrelationship of arts with other fields. We looked at sciences. There's not much overlap there. We looked at the importance of values primarily, but on page 406, history, is not just the study of the facts, who did what to whom. And sometimes when you study history, it just seems like a bunch of dates and names of people and events, but it's deeper than that. They use art a lot of times to interpret the values or ideals of the society. So get into the whys and what's going on and what was the thinking. The arts are a big way to understand that. Philosophy would be similar to that, reasoned answers to fundamental questions. It involves ethics and moral judgments. Why did they think this was the right thing to do? In my American Lit class, and we just finished with the colonial writers, and I just recently took a trip to Boston and heard some more of the arguments why the colonists at that time thought it was the right thing to do to basically be traitors and rebels against their king, which is pretty much morally agreed upon is wrong, but why they thought that was the right thing to do. And so sometimes when we go back and we read their letters, which is a type of like literature, and hear their philosophy, we can kind of find out that, and sometimes the arts help us with that as well. Okay, the last part here, arts and theology, wrapping up. Religion has its own set of values, and religions, this is just an overview, generally agree that their communion, their relationship with the sacred, with the deity, is more important than anything else. And the humanities and arts are full of religious art and religious expression. That's really big. For hundreds of years, that was all there was. And they kind of group together the common experiences of religious people. One, an uneasy awareness of how limited we are as human beings, an awe, kind of awareness of there being a greater being, and in awe of that greater being or this majestic mystery, and the conviction, belief that communion with this is very broad, further reality, this is of the most importance, more than anything else. And then our summary as we wrap up. Remember that humanities differ from the sciences because the sciences use strictly objective scientific standards. Arts and humanities are particularly tied to individual and cultural values, which is really important. And the significance is that humanities and the arts endures long after a culture's notion of science or technology have become obsolete. We can go back 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, and the science and technology of that time is obsolete. It's only studied historically, but we go back and we continue to learn from a study of the humanities and the arts of that same culture, and they still speak to us today. And that's kind of what I'll leave you with there as you ponder that, how important it is, how enduring it is, how meaningful it is, and just a reminder of that little clip that we studied at the beginning, from the movie Monuments Men. You take away your society's culture, you've taken away who they